Welcome to Human Monsters. I'm just going to begin with an announcement. I'd like to thank everybody once again for donating to the Kickstarter campaign. I'm recording on the new microphone, and it's working wonderfully. So thank you very much for that. I'd also like to ask everybody if you could just do me one small favor and go to the podcast's iTunes site. Look up on iTunes, and if you could write a review, that would be great. It would be so cool. Thank you very much. I appreciate all your feedback, and I appreciate that you listen to the show. Thank you so much.
Why do you seem so scared? All I wanted to do was play with you. Please come and play with me. I am so lonely. You're not afraid of the dark, are you? Don't be afraid. Come with me. I will show you where I play hide and seek. Do you want to play hide and seek? You hide, and I'll find you.
Georgia Tann was born in Philadelphia, Tennessee. Her father, George, wanted her to become a concert pianist and forced her to take piano lessons throughout her childhood. She graduated from Martha Washington College with a degree in music in 1913, but music was not her passion. She wanted to become a lawyer. Her father didn't want her to practice law because it was not ladylike. She took courses in social work, as this was considered an acceptable vocation for women at the time. Georgia was not ladylike. This had nothing to do with her profession. It was inborn. At variance with the Southern standard of womanhood, she was big-boned and broad-shouldered. Her demeanor was described as blunt and masculine. Considered to be unacceptable attire for women in this era, she frequently appeared in public wearing flannel shirts and pants. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and she often cut it so short it was comparable to a man's hairstyle. She had no interest in being a wife and mother. She had a strong personality and was intensely driven to achieve her goals. Had she been born a century later, she would have become more accomplished at an earlier age, doing something she would have preferred. She was so preoccupied with her own protection that she became selfish and narcissistic. She also lacked empathy. It was a dangerous combination. Georgia's involvement in social work came early. In her adolescence, when she volunteered with the indigent, it was a way to avoid dances, and while she didn't feel any empathy for the people she served, she was inspired years later to choose this pursuit as a career in social work. The tipping point came in 1935, with a case involving a baby that was born to a morphine-addicted mother. A Mississippi sheriff institutionalized the baby's mother and several of her children. Georgia recalled how this incident went down to a journalist. Hours later, the mother cried out something about her baby as the effects of the dope began to wear off. Officials at the institution called my father about it. The whole family had retired, but we got up and drove into the country. And there, under a pile of filthy rags in a corner of a shack, we found a pitiful baby, which had evidently been given a little of the dope. Her family brought it home. Georgia nursed the baby, but eventually the woman's children were assigned to an orphanage. This incident was an eye-opener for Georgia. She was exposed to the plight of young, neglected children like never before. This had nothing to do with a maternal instinct of love of children, however. A former employee of hers, Mary Hindman, remembered Georgia's feelings about children. She had no favorites among the babies. She was businesslike and treated them all the same. Georgia's grandchildren described her as cold. Her granddaughter Vicky sheds light on this. My mother promised to raise us very differently from how Georgia had raised her. She said Georgia was a cold fish. She gave her material things and nothing else. When Georgia's adopted daughter June experienced her first menstruation, she ran to Georgia. Georgia referred her to the maid and went back to sleep. The maids raised June. Commenting on this, Vicky said, "I don't know why Georgia bothered to adopt her." Georgia Tann's worldview was broken into two absolutes. Poor people, including single mothers, she called, quote, cows, and they were bad. She considered wealthy people as being, quote, of the higher type, and therefore good. She considered poor people to be incapable of proper parenting. She felt their children needed to be rescued. Her way of saving them was to seize them and place them up for adoption. In 1906, at the age of 15, Georgia arranged an adoption for the first time. Two children were found huddled in a corner of the courtroom over which her father presided as a judge. He placed them in the protection of the Mississippi Children's Home Society. This orphanage was more likely to warehouse the children or place them in foster care than arrange for adoptions. 3 weeks later, though, Georgia Tann persuaded a Mississippi couple to adopt the children. Her classist attitude influenced her choice of the couple. To quote a Memphis reporter in 1946, Miss Tann had found her life's work. Georgia considered poverty to be the most contemptible human condition of all. To quote a man named Andre Bond from Biloxi, Mississippi, it was her upbringing. She was from a very snobbish family that looked down upon people in those shanty houses who got their hands dirty for a living. Christine Nyland of Nashville said Georgia felt she was taking children from, quote, trashy people and elevating the children, unquote. Through Georgia, Christine was adopted by a couple who were cultured and educated. To quote Christine, it was as if she thought, there's something that doesn't belong over here, I'll put it over there. Georgia bragged about this, saying her wards were placed with what she called high-type adoptive parents. She felt birth parents who grieved over the loss of their children should be comforted by the privileges their progeny would enjoy. One young mother begged Georgia to return the 3 children Georgia stole from her in 1939. Georgia told her it was done for their welfare, that they were guaranteed to receive, quote, good homes and splendid educations. Georgia was even protected against criminal prosecution by an elitist lawyer who concurred with her vision of parenthood. As far as both of them were concerned, money equaled happiness. A letter sent in 1935 to a father who attempted to have Georgia's placement of his child for adoption reversed included the following statement. The child is fortunately placed in a home capable of lavishing every affection and advantage which wealth can give. Many children in her care died before they could be adopted. As far as she was concerned, dying was better than being raised by a loving biological parent in poverty. Rubbing elbows with the upper crust of society brought Georgia plenty of prestige and the pride that went along with it. She became independently wealthy and influential. To quote investigator Robert Taylor, she liked being on a first-name basis with the prominent people who adopted her children. Movie stars, directors, politicians. She hung photographs of famous clients like Joan Crawford and June Allison in her hospital room during her final days. They were autographed. To be precise, the signatures were forged by her staff. They were used to engaging in dishonest acts by this time, so it was nothing new to them. Georgia even told them to send her get-well cards and sign them with the autographs of celebrities and President Harry Truman. In 1916, the Mississippi Children's Home Finding Society was relocated to Jackson, and Georgia obtained a position with this organization as a field agent. One of her duties was to place orphans in foster homes. Adoption was not a common outcome. More often than not, the only way orphans could be spared the experience of institutionalization was to place them in work homes, where they earned their room and board by doing manual labor. Georgia was far more effective than most social workers at arranging adoptions. She also benefited in a way that set her apart from the others. Ethical social workers derived personal satisfaction from helping others. Georgia saw social work as a means to obtain power, praise, and wealth. The power and wealth was unattainable to ethical social workers. The agency had policies that prevented a situation where profit was emphasized over altruism. Unfortunately, there were no legal regulations to prevent this phenomenon from developing. Mississippi was not exactly the best state in the Union for adoptees. For instance, adoptive parents could adopt a child only under condition that the child be ineligible to inherit their estate. Ethical social workers objected to this on the grounds that it meant the child would be indentured into servitude. Georgia's supervisors began to provide financial aid to the biological relatives of orphans so that the children could remain with their families. Georgia did not possess her colleagues' scruples. She saw adoptive placement as a business. She saw orphans as cash cows and didn't concern herself at all with the rights of birth parents. The following story is a snapshot of Georgia's predatory adoption business at work. One morning in 1922, Georgia drove to the home of Rose Harvey. Rose was asleep inside. Rose was markedly disadvantaged. She was young, poor, widowed, pregnant, and suffering from complications of gestational diabetes. Her son, Onyx, 2 years old at the time, was playing on the back porch. Georgia lured him into her car. From there, she got her father to sign papers that declared Rose Harvey to be an unfit mother and designated Onyx an abandoned child. Onyx was placed with another family. Soon after, his 3-year-old brother was placed with a family. Heartbroken and enraged, Rose sued to regain custody of her children, but was unsuccessful. Georgia was the first social worker to not only make homeless children appealing to childless couples, but to make them impossible to pass up. While most social workers would apologize about the perceived unworthiness of orphans, Georgia would convince the adoptive parents that they were not born of sin and without genetic flaws, as was commonly assumed. She referred to them as blank slates. Since they were recently born, they were free from the long-term influence of their birth parents, and could therefore be molded by the values and surroundings of their adoptive parents. Georgia herself didn't believe that they were blank slates, but she knew it was the most effective sales pitch she could make, and it kept the money rolling in when it worked. She would say to them, rearing an environment mean much more than inheritance. She didn't rely on that slogan alone to close these sales. She also falsified the children's records. If a mother was considered by her to be nothing but poor white trash, she would change the background of the mother to that of a debutante. The fathers were medical students struggling financially before graduation, according to her doctored paperwork. What her clients were told was that the children benefited from a premium genetic pedigree, but had the misfortune to be born at an inopportune time. She would guarantee success with this pitch: 100 of our children turn out, on average, much better than 100 children raised in their families of birth. The reason is that ours is a selective process. We select the child, and we select the home. Georgia wasn't the only profiteer cashing in on the black market adoption business. So-called baby farmers who took in children from indigent homes were selling them for as much as $100. Adjusted for inflation, the cost would be approximately $2,377 2020. George's clientele expanded far beyond the borders of Tennessee and the rest of the United States. Her waiting lists contained names of couples who lived as far away as Canada and South America. To be fair, Georgia did save some children whose parents had died, given them up voluntarily, or abandoned them. Georgia may have been a mercenary, but she did do some good. Some of the children ended up in loving homes and were treated as well as if they had been conceived by the adoptive parents. That was completely incidental and unintentional, however. Indeed, it was the money that Georgia cared about. She was concerned about the plights of the birth parents least of all, as reflected in a letter a mother named Mary Owens wrote to a social worker, which went as follows: "Please help me get my baby back. I am so heartbroken about the way it has been taken from me until I'm about to have a nervous breakdown. After all, it is our own darling baby, and I would gladly lay down my life just to see her one time. Miss Tann said she would always let me hear about her, but it is just like asking about the dead. Please help us, as it is even harder to try to live." Investigator Robert Taylor commented on the adoptions handled by Georgia Tann with this quote: "Her babies died like flies." Georgia Tann was a full-time hustler for her child-selling operation at Tennessee Children's Home Society in downtown Memphis. She made rounds with the merchants, visiting door to door, requesting donations, and extolling the virtues and benefits of adoption. It appeared to be advocacy when in fact a process of branding was in motion. She sold them on the notion that adoption not only benefited the children, but also taxpayers, since they would not have to foot the bill for maintaining orphanages and other social services that work to ensure the health and well-being of children who had become wards of the state. She regularly emphasized the tax-related benefits. In the 1930s, she boasted of saving the taxpayers of Memphis $218,000 after she arranged 2,000 adoptions. Adjusted for inflation, that is approximately $5,182,000 2020. Georgia established a child placement empire with branch offices in every state. She had monopolized the system. This is a quote from a speech she made in 1949 in the Los Angeles office. "I want to hear from every family in the United States which would like to adopt a child, and from everyone who knows of a child who should be made available for adoption." Georgia Tann's child placement service was the McDonald's of adoption for years. Georgia began to receive national recognition. She delivered speeches on adoption in many major cities. One national magazine dubbed her the foremost leading light in adoption laws. Eleanor Roosevelt consulted her about child welfare issues. She was invited to the inauguration of President Harry Truman. She was even asked by author Pearl Buck to collaborate on a book about adoption. She had them all fooled. It was only 5 years after she began working in Memphis when she received national exposure in the media. The New York Times published an article about the director of an orphanage for black children, where the children were being abused. The headline was, "Welfare Worker Lays Alleged Forms of Punishment in Memphis Home to Woman Head." To quote the article, Miss Georgia Tann, Executive Secretary of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, charged today that Negro inmates of the Settlement Industrial Home were punished by being placed on hot stoves and made to stand on hot coals and in hot ashes. The social worker's report alleged that Bessie Simon, superintendent of the institution, was responsible for the alleged tortures, and that one little Negro's face was seared with a red-hot poker for punishment. She said Bessie Simon was collecting money for orphans and running a boarding school at the same time. Georgia wasn't the shining beacon of compassion for the indigent and their at-risk youth she was hyped up to be. Georgia abused children. She also collected boarding money from parents who were incapacitated. She even collected boarding money from parents without telling them their children had already been sold. One of her assets was her alliance with Edward Hall Crump, Memphis's most powerful and corrupt politician. Those who supported him were rewarded. Those who opposed him were punished. Georgia was quick to remind people of her connection to Crump. He provided her with protection. If a parent reported that she stole their child, the police ignored them. In a habeas corpus suit, the judge routinely ruled against the parents. Georgia had it made. The judges would approve her legal adoptions without question. One judge approved 14 in one day. The judge who served Georgia best was juvenile court judge Camille Kelly. While Kelly became an advisory figure to parents struggling with illness, unemployment, poverty, or divorce, Kelly would secretly sever their parental rights. She would then transfer custody of their children to Georgia. Kelly provided Georgia with a hefty sum of children. Of the 5,000 children Georgia placed for adoption, 20% of them were provided to her by Judge Kelly. A court worker from that time described Georgia's presence in the courtroom as being like a solitary vulture. Marie Long bore witness to the collusion between Georgia Tann and Camille Kelly in 1935. Marie, 15 years at the time, was living on a farm. She had 3 sisters and a brother. Her mother was sick with cancer and close to death. She asked the welfare department to board the children until relatives could care for them. A worker drove them to the juvenile court. They met Georgia Tann there. Marie describes her first impression of Georgia. She had a tight-lipped, hatchet face. She was hateful-looking, mean. She remembered Judge Kelly as being markedly better-looking and pleasant in disposition. Marie promised her siblings that she would keep them all together. Once they arrived at the court building, a worker grabbed her sister Christine and rushed her to a waiting car. Christine called out to her sister, crying, shouting her name several times. To quote Marie, I can still hear her screams. I begged the nuns at St. Peter's to tell me what had happened. Finally, one said Georgia Tann had flown Christine out of state to be adopted. Georgia made sure to grease the palms of all whose hands passed these children through the system. She bribed Judge Kelly and many others. Some of them were nurses who lied to mothers, saying their babies had died. If justice was a virus for most criminals, Georgia Tann had immunity. She was emboldened by her power and wielded it as a ruthless tyrant. A Memphis-based pediatrician tried to take her on in the 1940s, but failed. As she recounts, she was a relentless, cold-blooded demon, a female smiling Buddha, a very wicked woman. She got bigger and bigger the more power she had. She was pompous, self-important. She was like Hitler, riding around in a big Cadillac, driven by a uniformed chauffeur. She terrorized everyone. Georgia was combative, prepared to argue with anybody about anything, and she was tenacious. She never backed down. Journalists working in Tennessee at the time described her as, quote, domineering, tyrannical. Her ability to make those to whom she talked see her point was commanding. Her word was law. She intimidated children as often as adults. A woman had an encounter with Georgia when she came to her home to visit her mother. She recalls the effect Georgia had on her. Oh, we were scared to death of Georgia. When she spoke, we minded. She was just that way. A man named Billy Hale became one of Georgia's charges when he was a child. He remembered that she hit him for touching the glass beads of a lamp in the orphanage. Few adults criticized her in public. In fact, it was mostly after she died when the stories about her crimes came to light publicly. 3 days later, the governor of Tennessee revealed that Georgia Tann wasn't the, quote, angel of adoption the public believed she was. A Memphis pediatrician describes the front page of the paper, which featured a contradictory view of Georgia. To quote the doctor, "It was the strangest front page I've ever seen. On the right, there was a eulogy with tremendous use of Roget's thesaurus, praiseworthy words, saying what a wonderful woman she was. On the other half of the page, her crimes were detailed." Georgia's toughness came in handy many times. The aggrieved parents of some of the children she stole and placed for adoption assaulted her. One man even snuck into her house in the middle of the night to attack her. She managed to scare him off. Georgia either lobbied politicians to change adoption laws, or she simply ignored them. She emphasized the supposed ineligibility of the birth parents, whether based in truth or not, while turning a blind eye to any shortcoming the adoptive parents possessed when it came to properly raising a child. Pleasing them and cashing in on the transaction was the number one priority for Georgia Tann. She no longer waited for reports about unfit parenting to trickle in. To quote French social worker Elise de la Fontaine, she placed with no regard to whether children would be happy in their adoptive homes. It was hit and miss. She was trying to place every child in Memphis. She wanted to get her hands on every child she could. Within a year after she moved to Memphis, Georgia established a monopoly over the adoption system. Almost every local child available for adoption was wrapped tightly in her tentacles. Georgia frequently falsified the birth records of many of the children, replacing the real dates with one that indicated a more recent birth, because adoptive parents wanted young children. She falsified the ages of the abducted children to prevent their biological parents from finding them. Georgia sometimes took children door to door in hopes of selling them as if they were kittens or puppies. She dressed them in the best clothes available to create an optimum presentation. Mildred Stoves worked for the Memphis Department of Public Welfare in the 1930s. She described an encounter she had with Georgia Tann. "One day, Miss Tann just stopped in my office with this beautifully dressed, beautiful baby and said, 'Miss Stoves, I have a child for you.' Well, I refused it. Miss Tann did seem surprised, but I was young. I wasn't married. What did I want with a baby?" She said some of the other social workers were unable to resist the babies that were pitched to them and adopted them. Sometimes Georgia would blackmail these same people. If they criticized her unethical practices, she would threaten to reclaim the child or contact the birth parents, who would have been very aggressive in seeking custody. As far as kidnapping went, Georgia either did it directly, literally snatching the child from its mother's arms. That, or she would exploit her political and legal connections to issue illegal court orders to confiscate the child from their custody. She found the abductions to be more effective, and she usually handled them herself. She used every orphanage and maternity home in Tennessee as her private domain. Christine Nealon remembers Georgia's presence at the Tennessee Children's Home Society Orphanage in Nashville. "I can still hear her steps down the hallway and see her funny hats. She had big feet and wore black lace-up shoes. She always went upstairs to see the babies. There would be masses of them one day. They'd be gone the next." Georgia would take photographs of the babies she felt her clients would find most appealing. She would show adoptive parents the photos, and once the baby was placed, she would display the photos on the walls of her office. Children who were blonde-haired and blue-eyed were favored because she assumed her clients would favor that pedigree. She even employed so-called spotters, people who worked at orphanages, who would notify Georgia when they received a baby she could monetize to her satisfaction. Juvenile court judge Camille Kelly transferred custody of these children to Georgia Tann in short order. Sometimes she did some of the scouting herself. One orphanage orphanage worker knew something unethical was afoot, as she recalls. One of the nuns who worked at the orphanage during the 1940s said, "We knew something was rotten." This nun's superior would tell her, "Judge Kelly is coming," and she and the other sisters would scramble around, trying to hide the prettiest children from her. An adoptee by the name of Jim Lambert was physically and emotionally abused by his adoptive parents. He was placed by Georgia in the 1930s. His parents chose him when they saw an advertisement for him in the newspaper. Jim was a product. He was hardly alone in this. Georgia placed approximately 400 advertisements for orphan children between 1929 and the early 1940s. One example was featured on the front page of the Memphis Press Scimitar in November of 1930. The caption read, "Wants home." It was accompanied by a photograph of a small girl clad in a short dress with her hand on her hip. Another caption described her as a solemn little trick with big brown eyes. Madge is 5 years old and awful lonesome. An ad published on December 7th, 1935, bore the headline, "Yours for the Asking." It was accompanied by a photograph of a 5-year-old boy holding a ball. Next to the photo was the caption that read, "How would you like to have this handsome boy play catch with you? How would you like his chubby arms to slip around your neck and give you a bear-like hug? His name is George, and he may be yours for the asking." There were few differences between these ads and promotions for dolls placed by retailers of children's toys. Jim Lambert was not only taken from his mother by Georgia Tann, but he was separated from his siblings. One of them was placed in foster care, while the others were sent to families who lived out of state. Jim lived with a man who married a woman who resented Jim's presence in her husband's life. She hated him so much, she once hung him by his shirt from a hook in the basement for an entire afternoon. Jim was sent at the age of 9 to a boarding school. Years later, he was sent to another institution. Once there, he received a letter from his adoptive father. Describing the contents of this letter, Jim said, "He didn't want me anymore." He was eventually placed with the same Texas couple who adopted his sister, Betty Jo. He said they worked her like a slave. They also used Jim like cattle, forcing him to do back-breaking labor. He ran away but was found and was returned to Memphis. After enduring the horrors of another foster home, he enlisted in the Air Force when he was 17 years old. He managed to find happiness as an adult. He married and had 5 children. He managed to reunite with his sisters. He tried to find his birth parents, but they passed away before he could find them. He feels he lost his childhood. To quote Jim, "I feel angry, frustrated, like I was cheated out of a whole lot of life." George's financial standing was threatened due to governmental cutbacks, which is what compelled her to begin the marketing campaign. The following is quoted from the premiere of the campaign in an issue of the Press Scimitar on December 9th, 1929. "Want a real live Christmas present? A present guaranteed to add twofold to the joy of the holidays? Well, here's your chance. For 25 children, ranging in age from 3 months to 7 years, will be presented to as many lucky families Christmas Eve." The Press Scimitar is making special arrangements with Miss Georgia Tann, Executive Director of the Memphis branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, to place these babies. A variation of this was printed the next day. This time there were photos of 2 of the babies that were available for adoption. A quote from this ad, "See if you can pick out the boy in this picture. No, you missed. It's the other one. The curly head on the right, and his playmate on the left is the girl. She is 8 months, and the little boy is 1 year old. They have golden hair, blue eyes, and good dispositions. Applications should be sent to the Press Scimitar adoption editor. Say whether you want a boy or girl, brunette, blonde, or redhead. Blondes, by the way, are in the majority. The paper's readers responded enthusiastically. A mere 10 minutes after the paper went on sale, Georgia and the adoption editor were swamped with dozens of calls from prospective adoptive parents. She struggled to keep up with the demand. There was even a waiting list. The Christmas campaign went on for years. It was printed from November to the 1st of January. The caption read, "Could you use a Christmas baby? Which of 3 infant boys will you have for Christmas? Living dolls, 3 baby girls. For you. Are you in the market for a 14-year-old boy? Put your orders in early. Dan, Jimmy, Ray. Want one of them?" The one silver lining that emerged from this campaign is that it eliminated the stigma that at one time afflicted orphan children, which portrayed them as damaged goods. The ads were so popular that people who did not wish to adopt children enjoyed looking at them. Elderly citizens sometimes clipped photos of their favorite children. Young women had friendly debates over which children were cuter as they played bridge. There was a mountain of adoption applications in George's office, filling half the room. It rivaled the catalog items put up for sale by Sears. By 1935, she not only placed children in 48 of the 50 states, but some were sent as far afield as Mexico, Panama, Canada, and England. She personally handled 206 adoptions in 1928 alone. The average annual number of adoptions by ethical agencies like the Boston Children's Aid Society was more like 5. Georgia became independently wealthy from her adoption practices. To conceal the profit motive, she didn't mention prices in the newspaper articles. Instead, she charged the parents fees for transporting the child to their homes. The parents were to make out the check not to the Tennessee Children's Home Society, but to her personally. They were mailed to her private post office box. When she received a request to adopt one of the children in her charge, she or one of her workers visited the prospective parent's home. If she was satisfied by their social status and financial standing, she would set the process in motion. She charged $168.72 for the visit if they lived in California. Adjusted for inflation, that is approximately $2,520. If they lived in New York City, the assessment would cost $228.81. Adjusted for inflation, that is $3,466 in 2020 dollars. Parents living in other areas were charged similar rates. The delivery rate was $360, $5,454 2020 dollars to California, and $268.81, approximately $4,020 dollars in New York. Another fee was charged when the prospective parents were presented with the adoption papers. All told, California residents were charged $731.44 for the entire procedure, approximately $11,020 dollars. New Yorkers would be charged roughly the same amount for the entire procedure. Some couples were charged as much as $10,000, the equivalent of approximately $151,020 dollars. Most adoption agencies charged very little. She received few complaints, if any, since these children were typically adopted by wealthy or borderline wealthy clients. Because Georgia profited more from out-of-state adoptions, she recalibrated her operations to ensure that between 90 and 95% of all adoptions were to couples who lived in other states or foreign countries. With the word spreading about her adoption services far afield, childless couples pressured her to provide them with a child. To keep up with the demand, she kidnapped more and more children. Georgia went to work with her accomplices in the legal and political world. So-called roundups were conducted by groups of such individuals and their subordinates. Among those involved were juvenile court employees, social workers, and deputy sheriffs. They bore documents signed by Judge Camille Kelly, and they were dispatched to the homes of the poor, whether they be apartments, houses, farms, or even houseboats. They were told by Georgia which ones would be most desirable by prospective parents. The justification given as an official reason for putting the children into foster care was the ambiguous designation, poor home environment. Georgia wanted very young children. The children most vulnerable to being snatched up and put on the market were newborn to age 5. Sometimes she took older children. They were appealing to farm owners who saw them as little else than a source of free labor. Some of Georgia's spotters were nurses, doctors, and attorneys. Thanks to Georgia Tann, the system was rotting from the inside out. One mother who was duped by these workers was widow Grace Gribble. She struggled to provide for her 6 children and was counseled on how to do so by Memphis Family Welfare Agency worker Sarah Sims. Grace trusted Sarah and welcomed her into her home. Unfortunately, her trust was misplaced. One day, Sarah came by with a woman named Helen Rose. Grace was told that if she signed some documents, her children would receive free medical care provided by the Widow's Assistance Program. What transpired instead was Helen Rose said, "I'll take the 3 youngest children now." Realizing Helen was employed by Georgia Tann, Grace screamed, then fainted when she realized she relinquished custody of her children. As Helen carried the 3 children, she said of Kirby Gribble, "We have an order for a boy of this age and type." Sarah rushed to the juvenile court and confronted Georgia. She said, "Where are my babies?" Georgia said, "They're on their way to a much better life than you could provide them. You should thank me." Grace cried and pleaded for Georgia to give her back her children. Georgia said, "Forget them." It took Grace 7 months to get a lawyer who was willing to take on the case, considering the corrupt political and legal system that favored Georgia Tann. By the time it went to court, the children were adopted by couples out of state. The judge's final ruling included the following statement: "This is one of the sad tragedies of life that even a mother must endure for the best interests of her children." Very few parents were able to get their children back. One exception was Josie Statler. Shortly after Georgia died, she distracted a member of the staff at one of the orphanages, whereupon she rescued her daughter and fled to Massachusetts. Another rescue involved a boy named Luther. His father located his adoptive home. He waited in the bushes for days, and when the adoptive parent took their children for a walk, he whistled the word whippoorwill, which was a family signal the boy would recognize. The boy ran to his father. His father took him home, and they moved to Arkansas. It became inevitable that if you were an indigent parent in the Deep South at the time of Georgia's child trafficking enterprise, you were in grave danger of losing your child. The inevitability didn't make it hurt less. To quote one such parent, Evelyn Quillen, "It was agony. I prayed constantly that she was alive." Her daughter, 4 years old at the time, was kidnapped from a child care center in 1948. It wasn't just child care centers. She stole babies from playgrounds. If she saw children walking alone, she would lure them into her car with promises of ice cream. Most common sites for Georgia's underlings to snatch up children were hospitals. The spotters worked the maternity wards. They were contacted by staff when poor women went into labor. To quote Dr. George Lovejoy, Georgia Tann's workers stood outside the door of the delivery room, waiting. The minute the baby was born, they would take the papers in and have the mother sign them, and then the baby would disappear. One such victim of this procedure was Mary Reed, who was 18 years old when she gave birth to her son in 1943. She was administered a heavy dose of anesthesia. When she came to, she was presented with a document she was told was a so-called routine paper. As soon as the paper was signed, the child was sent to New Jersey, where he was adopted. Mary was heartbroken, and she filed a habeas corpus lawsuit against Georgia. Unfortunately, the corrupt doctor, who also happened to be Georgia's private physician, testified that Mary understood the nature of the papers she was presented with, which legally authorized relinquishment of the custody of her son. Though she never saw him again during his childhood, they had a reunion in 1992, when he was 48 years old. He was a pilot and was named Steve Popper. He found her while reading an article about Georgia Tann in Good Housekeeping magazine. When they reunited, Mary said to him, "Oh, honey, I've been waiting for this day all my life. Ever since you were born, I've been waiting for this day." These reunions were rare. Georgia's tactics regularly involved tricking mothers into signing adoption releases. Sometimes she would get a nurse to lie and tell the mother the baby was stillborn. A mother named Irene Green was a victim of this approach. As she emerged from the fog of anesthesia, she hadn't completely regained her faculties, but she knew the baby was alive. To quote Irene, "I heard my baby cry." The nurse lied and told her she was wrong. Mary demanded to see her baby so she could be provided with concrete evidence of its death. The nurse lied and told her it had been, quote, disposed of. Irene knew how hopeless the situation was and that she was unlikely to get her children back. She was the mother of Jim Lambert and his siblings. She was never able to regain custody of them. Irene remained poor for the rest of her life. When she died, she left behind nothing but her copy of the Bible. She inscribed the names and birth dates of her children inside of it. As an addendum, she wrote, "The children of a broken-hearted mother. I have no one to love me now." A woman named Earlene Phillips was adopted through Georgia Tann's technique of obtaining dubious consent. Her mother was 27 years old when she was impregnated by her older sister's husband. Earlene described her father as, quote, "a little country doctor, had my mama committed so no one would know about me." Then she had a nervous breakdown. Her mother was placed in the Boulevard Home for the Feeble-Minded by the father. Under those conditions, she was able to be duped into signing the paperwork to relinquish custody of her child to Georgia Tann. Her mother mourned the loss of her child for the rest of her life. Georgia became a highly skilled liar. A man named Edward Russell, 31 years old at the time he met Georgia, was divorced, a veteran, and single father of his 3 children. He approached her in 1949 to ask her for help with his children. To quote Edward, "She was very kind. She told me she thought the answer was for me to leave the children with her at the home, go to California to look for work, and that she would send the children out as soon as I was located. I remember her exact words. We will send them to you immediately after you have established yourself and can take care of them." He departed for Los Angeles the following day and found a job soon after. He elaborates further. "She assured me they were in good health and in good hands and not to worry." 2 months later, he still hadn't seen his children. He called Georgia numerous times, but he was getting him nowhere. He recalls how he went about resolving the problem. "So I finally quit my job and came back to Memphis to get them. I went straight to the home and asked Miss Tann for my children, and the only thing she said was that she thought it best to keep them. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. I begged her to let me see them, and she refused. Edward hired a lawyer, and they met with Georgia the next day in his attorney's office. He relates what happened there. I pleaded to see the children, and it wasn't until then that Miss Tann told me that the babies were placed for adoption in California 2 months earlier. She said 2 were with one family and the other with another family. A year later, he had remarried his wife and filed a lengthy habeas corpus lawsuit. He was still stunned by how deceitful Georgia was. I had no reason to believe she would trick me. I admired her. She seemed so interested in my case. She had a kind, soothing voice, and I trusted her. He had observed and experienced the horrors of war, but the pain he experienced in combat didn't compare to what he felt when he lost his children. As he said to a reporter at the time, "We've just got to get our children back. They're the whole world to us." He never saw them again. A woman named Barbara Davidson remembers the day she was signed over to Georgia. Her mother was not duped. She willingly relinquished custody of Barbara to Georgia. Her mother had recently divorced her ex-husband, who was an alcoholic, and then married a man who hated children. She chose her new husband over her daughter. On the day Barbara was signed over to her new life, her mother told her to put on her prettiest dress. Barbara was 6 years old at the time. To quote Barbara, "I remember her taking me to the mansion. We walked up the outside steps, and I tried to keep hold of her hand. I could hardly reach her fingers. She told me to play upstairs with the children. She had business to take care of, and then we would go home. But when I came out, no one was there, and no one was going to take me home, and I began to cry. A woman in a black dress told me, 'Shut up, shut up. You are never going home. Shut up.'" Barbara describes this day as the worst of her life. She was sent to a home in California. Her adoptive father sexually abused her. During the Great Depression, most businesses suffered and many shut down. Georgia Tann was one entrepreneur who profited from one of the bleakest periods in the history of the American economy. Many parents were unable to provide for their children and surrendered them to social workers and orphanages. Though it was a heartbreaking decision to make, they felt it was in the children's best interests. Most of them assumed they would regain custody of their children once they found work and got back on their feet. When parents applied for social assistance to keep the children fed, Georgia Tann smelled fresh blood and swooped in. She didn't have to rely on spotters to find the poorest parents. She simply had to read the applications, which contained their contact information. Single mothers were especially vulnerable to Georgia's predatory acquisition instincts. She benefited from the way society viewed single mothers at the time. They were perceived as so-called moral deviants, possessed of excessive sexual equipment. One change in society that occurred thanks to Georgia Tann was that poor mothers were perceived as selfish if they didn't give up their babies for adoption. There had once been a law that required that single mothers breastfeed their babies for 6 months. The law was enacted to ensure the mother bonded with the child and remained committed to raising them. Thanks to Georgia Tann, significant reversals to laws like this and others like it were inverted by the late 1930s. Single mothers were then prevented from not only bonding with the babies, but from even seeing them. Many of these mothers were blindfolded during labor. Many social workers pressured pregnant, unwed mothers to sign forms giving consent to doctors to circumcise the male children so that the workers could keep the mothers uninformed of the baby's gender. White single mothers were expected to surrender their babies for adoption, whether they wanted to or not. This relinquishment was endorsed by leaders of such organizations as the Child Welfare League of America, the American Public Welfare Association, the Salvation Army, Catholic Charities, and most psychiatrists and psychologists. Social scientist Clark Vincent predicted a future in which the infants of all single white mothers would be seized by the state. To quote Vincent, "Such a policy would not be enacted or labeled overtly as punishment. Rather, it would be implemented under such pressures and labels as scientific finding, the best interest of the child, rehabilitation goals for the unwed mother, and the stability of family and society." Pearl Buck shared George's attitude regarding adoption, and she published an article in Woman's Home Companion in which she advocated legislation that would force single white mothers to place their babies for adoption. The law was never passed, but the social pressure on single white mothers to give away their children was immense and keenly felt. They began relinquishing their children in droves. By the 1950s, 90% of white maternity home residents signed adoption releases. Single white mothers were shamed for their predicament, and their relatives would sometimes hide them in their homes for fear that their neighbors would find out their daughters were, quote, in trouble. A book called Wake Up Little Susie was published, which detailed the plight of single pregnant women between 1945 and 1965. One woman told the story of the effect missing a period had on her during this time, when single pregnancy was a source of shame. 2 weeks went by. They dragged at a snail's pace. Day was joined to night like links in a heavy chain, which coiled around me and dragged wherever I walked. I lifted heavy weights. I jumped from the height of the table to the floor until I didn't have the strength to climb back on the table again. At night, I sat in hot mustard baths and slept with my head pounding from the effects of quinine. I drank tansy tea and swallowed capsules full of turpentine until all I wanted to do was retch out my insides and die. I thought of dying. With all my heart, I wanted to die. When I didn't come around during the second month, I was desperate. My face became gaunt and haggard. My eyes sank deep into their sockets. My clothes were always damp with sweat. I'll kill myself, I would murmur into the darkness at night. I'll take poison and kill myself. Georgia Tann would entice such women to accept her help by placing an ad in newspapers which read, "Young women in trouble, call Miss Georgia Tann." She and her staff visited doctors throughout Tennessee and other states and offered single pregnant women free room and board and medical care in one of the maternity homes with which she was affiliated. They were later dubbed baby farms. She was lenient enough to allow anesthesia to be administered. The homes were often owned by religious organizations, and she exempted the women from singing hymns if they didn't want to. The homes were okay with this. All that mattered to them was receiving the monthly fee of $40 Georgia paid to them, approximately $620. Georgia told the pregnant women they would have 1 month to decide if they wanted to put the child up for adoption. They didn't get that month. After coming out of anesthesia, they would be informed that their child was stillborn or on their way to an adoptive home. They gave their consent on forms they signed while they were still high on the anesthesia. Many of the mothers didn't protest because they were in a desperate situation with no way to support the child and no other alternatives. One mother who regretted giving her child up was Ann Cardell, who commented on the experience in 1975 when she was 63 years old. She was reunited with her son, a psychiatrist by the name of Gordon S. Livingston. He was 37 at the time. She told Gordon about his father. "Your father was the only man I ever loved. She was a 26-year-old teacher when they met." She went on, "He was a wonderful dancer. I went to Memphis to have you. I couldn't shame my parents." Anne hoped he would be adopted by the woman who boarded her during the pregnancy, but Georgia sent him to a couple who lived in Chicago. Anne regretted the decision. She became depressed and gaunt. Eventually, she found a way to cope with this loss. She pretended she hadn't lost him. She imagined his life progress in her mind, as she recounts. "By 1944, you were 6 and starting first grade, the very grade I was teaching. I couldn't wait for school to start. I saw you in every child's face. When I administered IQ tests, I hoped the boy with the highest score was you. When I comforted a crying, defeated child, I feared he might be you. You grew so quickly that year. You were aggressive and vulnerable, cocky and easily wounded. I learned you needed an atmosphere of tolerance and love. I tried to give it to you by giving it to all those children. It was an illusion, of course, but I half believed it, and when I said goodbye to that class in the spring, I felt sick with guilt. It was as if I was abandoning you for the second time. Then, the following winter, I learned the third grade teacher was retiring. I immediately petitioned the school board for a transfer, and I got it. I would be your teacher again, this time when you were 8. That year, as I watched you mature, I was proud you were becoming your own person, and I felt selfish for trying to hold on to you. At the end of the year, I stopped imagining you were with me, but I always wanted you back. I prayed that one day I would meet you as a man. Gordon recalled how he felt about this. I just sat there, immobilized by my own emotions. Slowly, she held out her arms, and for the first time in 37 years, we touched. Many local pediatricians accused Georgia of letting several of the children in her care die when medical intervention could have prevented their demise. She certainly never expressed any remorse when this did occur. She only admitted that 2 such deaths actually occurred, those being in October 1945. She refused to even admit that some of the children fell ill. She would not allow the boarding mothers to seek medical help. Sometimes when children were deathly ill, the boarding mothers would take them to the hospital. Quite often this was done when it was too late. Many of them were buried in the Elmwood Cemetery. When she was able to conceal a death from the public, she often had the body cremated by the Thompson Brothers Funeral Home to get rid of the evidence. No death certificates were issued for these children. Many of these deaths were caused by heat prostration or overheating of the body, a common threat in the hot climate of the Deep South. Others were caused by a combination of starvation and dehydration, whose inception involved a gastrointestinal infection. These conditions caused tremendous discomfort and pain. Again, these deaths were always preventable. Pediatrician Charles Carter, who volunteered for Georgia's home, said it disturbed him that Georgia would frequently override his orders when he recommended a method to treat one of the ailing babies. To quote Dr. Carter, I had prescribed penicillin and learned later that she'd ordered her nurses to stop giving it to the baby, but continue to chart it as if they were. Georgia Tann simply would not listen. She would say, I'll take your words under advisement. But she never did. She did what she felt best, regardless of what anyone said. She felt she knew the babies and what the babies needed. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was commonplace to keep a full-term infant in the hospital for a week. Premature babies were held until their weight reached 5 pounds. Georgia Tann ignored this protocol, scooping up a baby just a few hours after they were born and shipping them out to the adoptive parents, even if they were located thousands of miles away. The babies often arrived at their new homes feverish and dehydrated. Some of them died before they reached their destination. One couple in New Jersey received a dead baby after having been sent a baby with a heart defect. So many of Georgia Tann's children were ailing that a hospital in Memphis reserved an entire ward just to care for them. A hospital in Los Angeles did the same. Many doctors complained about this practice, but the wall of corruption was impervious to these inquiries, and Georgia Tann was protected as always. She was free to let more children die in her care. By 1932, Georgia had been living and working in Memphis for 8 years. By the end of that 8-year period, the infant death rate in Memphis was the highest of any American city with a population of over 100,000. The number continued to rise over the next 2 years. In 1935, the U.S. Children's Bureau dispatched Dr. Ella Oppenheimer to Memphis to conduct an investigation. It didn't take her long. In a report called Infant Mortality in Memphis, she wrote, "The most striking difference in cause of mortality between Memphis and the cities with which it is compared is mortality from gastrointestinal disease among white infants, which in 1934 was very much higher in Memphis than in any of the other cities except in Louisville. The report did nothing to curb Georgia's practices. As usual, she was protected by corrupt politicians. Still, a campaign to create a new law to require that boarding homes for children be licensed was started. To prepare, Roberta Miller, director of the Child Welfare Division of the Department of Public Welfare, conducted a study of 10 of Memphis's boarding homes for children. In 1944, her caseworker Faye Wallace reported the findings in the Tennessee Public Welfare Record. 9 of the 10 homes examined were overcrowded. 10 children resided in a 2-room apartment. In one home, 6 babies shared a single crib. Another home lacked a refrigerator, and the babies were fed spoiled milk. One child suffered from syphilis. Another suffered from tuberculosis. Georgia refused to seek medical treatment for them. 16 children were housed in the attic of a house that was condemned by the fire department as a fire trap. 2-year-old twins lived with a 79-year-old woman who was senile and nearly blind. She addressed them as old man and old lady and fed them the same kind of bread scraps you might throw to the pigeons. In an article published in the Tennessee Public Record and written by Roberta Miller entitled, "What Do You Know About Tennessee's Adoption Laws?" in 1944, she wrote, "Tennessee is one of the few remaining states which has no legislation regulating boarding homes for children. We would not go to a beauty shop or restaurant which is unlicensed. Yet by our inertia and lack of interest in safeguarding children, we sit back and wink at the commercial boarding homes operating in Tennessee for babies and small children." She didn't mention Georgia Tann by name, but everybody knew that the poor standards of care left her as the only person to blame. Her lawyer wrote letters of complaint to Roberta's boss, but she and her allies were undeterred. Finally, in 1945, the legislature passed a law that mandated that every children's boarding home in Tennessee was required to be inspected and licensed. Not to be outdone, Georgia used her political clout to shield herself from this legislation. Her boarding homes were not required to comply. Having successfully avoided compliance, children in Georgia's care continued to die. In a home on Poplar Avenue, conditions were even worse than in the boarding homes. A woman named Mrs. Leon Sims worked in this home and commented on the conditions. In summer, the heat was unbearable. It was particularly hard on the children with fevers. Though Georgia referred to her and the other 2 caretakers as nurses, Mrs. Sims said, "None of us were honestly nurses. I was the only person on duty at night and cared for as many as 25 children. Everyone needed attention, but I simply didn't have enough time. There was a lot of illness. The main problem was diarrhea. Babies are always at risk of gastrointestinal illness because their bodies can dehydrate within hours. The worst epidemic of this ailment in one of Georgia's homes occurred in 1945. 40 to 50 children died in less than 4 months. Dr. Clyde Croswell volunteered his services in the home. He pressured Georgia to place the sick babies in the hospital and to refrain from admitting any more children into the orphanage. As usual, she ignored any advice that recommended a course of action that was in the best interests of the children. Georgia insisted to him that only 2 children had died. Dr. Croswell met with her lawyer, Abe Waldauer, and other members of her board of directors. To quote Dr. Croswell, "I offered to show them a list of the infants who had died, a staggering toll. They didn't want to see it." Dr. Croswell, Dr. Carter, and 4 other Memphis doctors submitted a complaint to probate court judge Samuel Bates. Judge Bates' court officiated over Georgia's adoptions for a long time. In May of 1946, Judge Bates sent a letter to the commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare, a man by the name of William Schoaf. The doctor's complaints were listed with explicit detail. One item they were especially concerned about was the epidemic of dysentery that killed between 40 and 50 children. They also drew attention to Georgia's failure to screen adoptive parents, utilizing the recommended protocol. They also felt that advertising the children for adoption in newspapers was inappropriate and crass. Failing to assess the children for medical care was another shortcoming they addressed. The following are other items from the letter. Dr. C.E. James, who maintains an office in the Methodist Hospital, stated that if the babies released to the Tennessee Children's Home Society that were born at the Methodist Hospital, all would leave there in perfect health, but in many instances were returned in 1 or 2 months in an emaciated condition, and that many of them died as a result of neglect. He recalled an instance where a child was given to prospective adoptive parents, but that it lived only 2 weeks. Dr. Croswell stated that he had advised Miss Tann not to bring the babies out of the hospital before they weighed at least 5 pounds, but she continued to disregard this advice. On an occasion, he told her not to bring any children into the home because of an infection. She brought in 5, and 3 or 4 of them died. Miss Tann, according to Dr. Croswell, had a woman assistant by the name of Flanagan, who frequently came on duty in a drunken condition. She gave castor oil in disregard of his instructions. Dr. Croswell secured the services of a registered nurse and tried to put her in charge of the babies, but Miss Tann would not permit this, with the result that the nurse left. Dr. Croswell said he couldn't be party to things going on of that type and continue a good citizen, so he discontinued his connection with the Tennessee Children's Home Society. The mortality rate that is reported is nothing in comparison to what it actually is. Judge Bates' letter culminated in a show cause order. This meant that unless his charges were proven to be baseless, Georgia Tann was to be removed from her position as head of the Memphis location of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. In the event that that would transpire, he would stop approving her adoptions. Judge Bates wanted Schoaf to investigate Georgia and shut her operation down. Schoaf had the power to do so, but the obstruction he was up against was Edward Crump. Schoaf dropped the ball. He gave the responsibility of investigating Georgia Tann to her attorney and members of her board of directors. They read a letter of rebuttal from Georgia. It was full of deflection, indignation, and deception. One such statement went as follows. Dr. James' statement that in many instances, babies released to the Tennessee Children's Home Society in perfect health are returned in 2 or 3 months in an emaciated condition, and that many of them died, is not true. Some of our babies died, but not from neglect on the part of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. This is an infamous attack. Naturally, her attorney and the board members dismissed the charges as, quote, groundless, irresponsible, and valueless, and false from beginning to end. As usual, the safety and well-being of the children never came first. Despite being a politician, Schoaf said he had no authority in the matter. Judge Bates was not intimidated by Georgia and her attorney. He stopped approving her adoptions. This didn't stop her. She and her lawyer met with judges in rural Tennessee counties. They weren't even lawyers, but they were politically connected, and they signed all the adoption decrees she submitted to them. Though Georgia was enabled in large part by Edward Crump, an asset that worked to her advantage that even he couldn't compete with, was the prevailing attitude in society that adoptable children were expendable. The author of an article that was published in a 1930 issue of the Saturday Evening Post described the assortment of babies that were available to adoptive parents, from beautiful babies, ugly babies, brilliant babies, dull babies, healthy babies, sick, handicapped babies, babies with blue eyes, brown eyes, black eyes, with golden hair, black hair, curly locked and straight. Babies thin and babies fat, 3 months or years old, and all the way stations in between, babies with full family histories and babies with no family history, without age, name, or birth certificate, unknown waifs, tossed into alleyways or dumped into garbage cans. The article stated that these babies had to sell themselves, as detailed in the following quote. Baby girls are more feminine, alluring. They are grand little self-advertisers, and they know instinctively how to strut their stuff. They stretch out their dimpled arms, gurgle at some secret baby joke, blow air bubbles from moist Cupid's bow mouths. And women and strong men grow mad, become besotted with adoration, and want to kidnap them on the spot. Males with the so-called wrong hair color were at a disadvantage. To quote the article, if a boy is red-headed, his chance of finding a new mama and papa is practically zero. Nobody wants him at all. Georgia continued to run her baby ads in the newspapers, and many readers continued to peruse them. Not everybody was charmed by these ads, however. Journalist Alfred Anderson recalls his feelings about it. I moved to Memphis in 1936 and was horrified to see on the front page of the paper a picture of a little baby that was going to be given away. They didn't do things like that in Texas. Charles C. Karstens, once the executive director of the Child Welfare League of America, saw the Christmas baby ads once they were syndicated, and he was outraged. He contacted Georgia Tann and warned her to stop running the ads. The ads were cited as the primary cause for excluding Georgia and the Tennessee Children's Home Society from the league. Another reason was her failure to properly screen adoptive parents. Georgia lied about this matter, saying she withdrew from the league voluntarily due to a disagreement over policy. Georgia took another strategy to marketing the children. She made them perform. She said to one little girl, "Sit on that man's lap and call him daddy." She would demean children by pandering to her clients' every whim, giving the children to them not as babies to raise, but living objects to give as gifts. One such child was Wilhelmina Newsom. To quote Wilhelmina, "I was bought by a couple and given as a gift to my adoptive family. My adoptive mother was depressed over the death of her own mother, and instead of buying her a puppy, her friends gave her me." Georgia would debase the children by using them as bargaining chips. She would use them to bribe social workers and politicians when they opposed her adoption practices. She once gave a Tennessee legislator 2 children when he vowed to support adoption reform legislation. On occasion, Georgia would send 2 or 3 children to a couple on a trial basis, giving them as much as a year to decide on which child or children they wanted to keep. Georgia's lawyer often referred to the children as products. As he once said in a letter to a client, "It is not often that we have the good luck that we have in your case, namely, of having the merchandise in hand and in stock to deliver to you immediately." In a letter to an applicant with less prosperous prospects, he said, "This is one business in which we can never tell when we can fill an order." In 1947, he told a prospective client that the adoptive parents had, quote, "complete custody and control of a child for 1 year, may submit the child to any physical or mental examination they wish, and take any steps they may desire to ascertain they have a healthy and normal child. If it is not, the Tennessee Children's Home takes it back, without question." Many of Georgia's clients sent children back. Sometimes they were told the child was intellectually gifted, but found out that this was not the case. The experience was painful and humiliating for the children. Their pain meant nothing to Georgia, of course. She only resented them for falling short of expectations. One such child was Virginia Simmons. To quote Virginia, "I was told my adoptive mother ordered me like out of a Sears Roebuck catalog." Virginia developed scoliosis. Her mother was outraged. As Virginia said, She said, "I spent a lot of money on you, and you're such a disappointment. If I'd known you were going to develop that crooked back, I would never have picked you out." Despite the generous seeming return policy, she once sent a letter to the editor of the Press Scimitar in 1938, wherein she castigated a couple in White Plains, New York, who declared their intentions to return a child with a severe intellectual disability. To quote the letter, "The law is definite and its view of an adoption is final. If a child has been carried through to the point of legal adoption, to the adoptive parents, he is their child. From that point on, the fact that he is adopted should never enter into consideration of his problems. If the White Plains couple had borne this child, they would have had to cope with his handicap. Whatever their solution would have been, it is the answer to their adopted child's problem. The finality of adoption must be upheld, or the whole structure of the institution, based as it is upon the concept that the adoptive parents stand in the place of the birth parents, is destroyed." Most of the adopted parents were more scrupulous than Georgia Tann, and kept the children that disappointed them initially. When falsifying the birth records, Georgia and her lawyer would often lie about things like the parents' religion. If a Jewish couple wanted to adopt a Jewish baby, Georgia would falsify a Gentile mother's baby's record to indicate Judaism as the religion of its ancestry. They would even go as far as changing the child's surname to a name that was more common among Jews. If this had been the worst of her practices when placing children with couples, this case may never have come to light decades later. It got worse. Georgia often placed children with abusive parents. Eugene Calhoun, 7 years old at the time, was sent to a farmer who was so viciously abusive, Eugene spent his first 3 days there watching his adoptive mother die of food poisoning as she begged her husband for help. The man wasn't any more sympathetic or charitable to Eugene. Eugene wore rags and went shoeless as he worked the fields for 18 hours a day. He slept in an unheated bedroom at night. He was beaten with belts and farm tools. The farmer split his spine with a post hole digger. Eugene underwent surgery to remove bone fragments from his spine. Decades later, by some miracle, he was spared the fate of being paralyzed. When he was 16 years old, he ran away and joined the Navy. Years later, he found success as a printer and graphic designer. He later reunited with his long-lost mother and siblings after being apart for 60 years. Sometimes a couple would adopt to replace a child who had died. It was not effective, and quite often the adoptee would suffer. Joy Barner knew growing up that she was a disappointment to the parents who raised her. Though she was initially led to believe they were her birth parents, one day she opened a trunk and found a photograph of a little girl. Some articles of the girl's wardrobe were kept inside the trunk as well. Joy asked her adoptive mother, "Were these mine?" Her mother said, "No, they were your sister's, and she's dead. Don't ever mention her again." But there were roughly things like you put on little girls to make them feel partyish. I asked her why I didn't have dresses like that. She said, "Because you were plain." When Joy was 14, her mother took her to a beauty salon for a permanent wave. Joy was very pleased with it, but her adoptive father became enraged by the sight of it. He said to his wife, "What are you trying to do? Make a whore out of her like her mother?" Joy eventually came to feel lonely and unloved. She found some emotional solace in her friendships, though her adoptive parents did not allow her to socialize when it was up to them. When she was 15, she asked permission to attend a picnic with a male classmate. It was a hard sell, not because he was a boy, but because he was Jewish. Her adoptive father was anti-Semitic. He reacted by saying, "What's his nickname? Isn't it Jaime? He's a Jew." Joy said, No, he's not." Her adoptive father picked up a glass of iced tea and threw the contents in her face. He said, "If I say he's a Jew, he's a Jew." When she was 17, she fell in love with another classmate. His name was Jake, and he was a Gentile. Her father wouldn't allow her to date him either. On Valentine's Day in 1939, she and Jake eloped in Little Rock, Arkansas. They went back to their parents' homes afterwards. Joy hoped to keep the secret dormant within a girlfriend's care. A few days later, when she returned home from school, her father screamed at her, telling her he would have the marriage annulled. Joy was defiant this time, saying, "Then I'll just marry him again." Her adoptive father dragged her to a steel box in which he kept important documents. It was then that he revealed his true feelings for her. "You were a mistake. I want you to know I paid $500 for you, and I could have gotten a good hunting dog for a lot less. You come from the lowest scum on earth." Joy was devastated. She started to cry. Her adoptive father went on, "Don't bother to cry. That's what you come from." He whipped her adoption papers down at her feet. He said, "Now don't go looking for your people. Don't open Pandora's box." Her adoptive mother watched and did nothing. Joy went on to have 2 sons and enjoy life on her own terms. She chose to disengage from her memories of her abusive childhood. Though Georgia Tann refused to help her obtain information about her birth parents, she learned about them from another source. Her parents were poor and lived on a houseboat. Her parents loved her. She and her brother Grady were stolen from the boat in 1925. She reunited with Grady after 64 years. Another sibling reunion of this fashion occurred between Barbara Davidson and her sister Mary. Both of them suffered acutely while in Georgia's care. To quote Barbara, "It was a horrendous thing that Georgia did, and only God can help her. I don't know if even God can help her." Georgia sexually abused both girls while they were in her custody. Many others reported that Georgia sexually abused children. A man and his twin brother suffered sexual abuse in the 1940s while under Georgia's care. They were less than 8 years old. He recalled this scenario in an interview with the Daily Pantagraph. "We remember being in a big bed, stripped naked. Georgia Tann and some other people were there, reaching for us and kissing us and touching us where we shouldn't be touched. The twins were taken from their mother at the age of 5. After their time in the Tennessee Children's Home Society orphanage in Nashville, they were adopted by a couple in California. There they were beaten mercilessly by the adoptive mother, often using the cord of an electric iron. At one point they couldn't take it anymore and ran away. They were sent to Memphis and put in the Porter Home and Leith Orphanage. Later they saw a page from the institution's record book. This is the quote from one section. "Miss Tann wants these twin boys to have institutional training. The so-called training was required by Georgia before they were to be placed with a couple. They were viewed every Sunday by prospective parents until a kind farming couple adopted them. They never got over being separated from their mother. In 1987, they searched for her and their 2 sisters. They found them and were happily reunited." Barbara Davidson and Mary were voluntarily abandoned by their mother to Georgia Tann in 1942. They were housed in an orphanage that was frequently visited by Georgia. Their mother was an alcoholic who was so neglectful as a parent, they resorted to rummaging through their neighbors' trash cans for food. Barbara and Mary were always close. Their bond was further solidified once they were taken into Georgia's custody. To quote Barbara, "Mary was all I had. She slept near me at night, but it was still frightening. The beds creaked and the floors were cold, so cold, and I would cry for a blanket, but no one would give me a blanket." Barbara recalled that rules were strictly enforced at the orphanage. The punishments were both cruel and unusual. The children were not allowed to use the bathrooms at night. If they wetted their beds due to the lack of access to the facilities, they were beaten. Mary was beaten almost every evening. One beating was a warning, the rest were punishments. Another offense was sneaking a drink of water. She recalls how this was enforced. "I remember them patrolling, checking our beds, shining a light in our faces. They carried big black flashlights. One night a woman pulled me out of bed by the hair and beat me and beat me. She said I stole a lemon gumdrop, and I said I didn't do it. Mary said I didn't either. But the woman hit me in the head, and hung me in the closet. Locking a child in a closet became the most frequent form of punishment. The children would be bound with rope around their wrists and hung by the ropes from coat racks. Their feet didn't touch the floor. It was while Barbara was bound in a closet that Georgia Tann molested her. To quote Barbara, she ran her hands all over me and played with me. That stuff. She said if I cried out, she'd hit me in the head. Mary recalled being assaulted by Georgia Tann in both a closet and in the bathroom. Once she used a wooden spoon. To quote Mary, she squatted over me, gouging me. She seemed like a giant. She was sadistic, evil. I thought of her as the devil. Another adoptee was 5 years old at the time she was sexually assaulted by Georgia in a bedroom. She recalled the incident. Yes, sexual abuse at the hands of Georgia Tann was very true, and it was presented as your favor. She was first taken with the decor of the room, which was a far cry from the rest of the facility in terms of its opulence. To quote this adoptee, a gorgeous room. I remember the shock of the room, so overwhelming and beautiful. I remember being told to come sit in her lap. I keep trying to block it all out, but it keeps coming. It's caused me a lot of problems. You won't find a lot of healthy adults who went through there. The children molested by Georgia were always girls, but boys who were housed in her facilities were also sexually assaulted, typically by male staff. Though there are no statistics available to gauge exactly how many of the children were assaulted, one male adoptee said, back then, every boy in an orphanage got molested. It was common in the experience of children who became wards of the state. Georgia was rare in that she not only tolerated the abuse, but indulged in it. One doctor who tried and failed to take Georgia down commented on society's feelings about child sexual abuse at the time. People didn't talk about child physical or sexual abuse. It was all in the closet all over the nation. He was unable to help Georgia's children, but he would devote his life and work to helping abused children from the 1970s onwards. An important event in the history of the treatment of such children was a 1961 publication of a study titled The Battered Child Syndrome. He described it as, quote, a sensation. It woke us all up. Until then, doctors assumed that if one of their child patients repeatedly broke bones, it was because they were maladroit. The men responsible for abusing Georgia's children were protected as much as she was from prosecution. The doctor recalled this, I saw it with my own 2 eyes. No doubt about that. Attendants, yard guys, taking boys out into the woods, that was just everyday, normal activity. We thought that was life. One man named Randall Gookin, who spent time at one of Georgia's orphanages, said he himself was not beaten or touched inappropriately. He did recall that he and other children would be photographed in the nude. Because he was considered ugly due to birth defects, he was not adopted right away. It was only when he got older that he was adopted for the purpose of becoming some foster parent's slave. To quote Randall, I waxed floors, washed dishes, vacuumed, mowed lawns, fed the cows, cleaned out barns. I was a little servant. No one ever came to check on me. I was beat with rose bushes, rubber hoses, razor strops, 2x4s. It wasn't just the adoptive parents who were cruel to him. His adoptive siblings would join in. To quote Randall, they'd say, you're not our brother. You're just here to work. We don't have to. I was with one family that had a truck patch out on James Road during tomato picking time. Their boys and I were supposed to pick tomatoes. They wouldn't work, and I had to fill up their baskets. I got mad and threw a whole bunch of tomatoes at them, ruined them. And the father beat me with a garden hose. I said, I'll fix him. and unhitched the trailer of tomatoes so it rolled down the road and turned over and squashed everything. And he beat me again, and I ran away. He was sent back to Georgia Tann and was placed with several other foster homes until he ran away for good at the age of 15. He later married. While the abuse others suffered left them broken for life, Randall says it had the opposite effect on him. Could you believe me if I told you that being raised in an ugly duckling world and being punished and made to work like a slave made a person out of me? It gave me a lot of determination to fight and do better for myself. I think I learned a lot. I sure as hell don't think kids should be mistreated, but it made me independent, made me work for what I want. Billy Hale suffered horrific sexual abuse at one of George's homes. The perpetrator was a handyman named Peterson who lived in the basement. One day Billy fell in a mud puddle. A member of the staff told him to stay on the porch until he dried. Underneath the porch was an entrance leading to the basement. Peterson came out and approached Billy. He said, "Come with me." Billy knew something untoward was afoot, and he tried to dodge Peterson's clutches. But Peterson grabbed him and carried him to the basement. Once in the basement, Peter laid Billy on a bed with filthy sheets. Peterson unbuttoned his overalls and said, "Don't you cry. I'll kill you if you do." Peterson raped Billy dozens of times in this kind of scenario. He tore Billy's anus so severely that Billy was frequently incontinent. Eventually, he was left with no choice but to undergo surgery to repair the damage. Billy describes the way in which he coped with the abuse while it happened. "In my head, I built a safe room. It had thick walls and no windows and big locks on the door. I went in there whenever he touched me, and it was like I couldn't feel, like I was just watching a movie involving some other boy." Barbara Davidson described the long-term psychological impact of the abuse she suffered while under Georgia Tann's care. She was frequently hit in the scalp so that nobody could see the bruises. She was so deeply traumatized that she has to be anesthetized to undergo simple procedures like teeth cleaning. Many of the children, Barbara among them, developed claustrophobia from being locked and hung in the closets. Others were unable to immerse their heads in water or sit in bathtubs. This was due to the bathing techniques used by Georgia's staff. Joe Pennell witnessed this in 1945 at the age of 10. He said, "Some of the workers had a bad habit of ducking kids underwater and holding them down. The younger children were the most frequent target of this mistreatment. Joe and another child monitored the little girls' baths. He said, "One day we saw a woman holding Gus's sister Barbara Jean underwater. Joe told me he and Gus shoved the woman and grabbed their little girl. She was just about drowned." Barbara also commented on the bathing procedures. "The bathtubs were some of the most frightening things. We'd have to stand in the hallway naked, boys and girls together. Stand in a straight line," the woman in front would say, "and we'd be shaking, seeing the steam coming out from those tubs. The water was hot, so hot, scalding. I can't believe they enjoyed hurting us. They used the water to keep us in control." They were also underfed. According to Heidi Naylor, she was fed little else but cold oatmeal. By the time she was adopted at age 7, she had crooked legs caused by rickets. She also had scars on her back and buttocks from frequent whippings with a switch removed from a rose bush. Her younger siblings, Arthur and Judy, remained in Memphis for about a year. They were also malnourished. To quote Arthur, "I was so hungry I'd sneak into the kitchen and swipe cabbage and lettuce. It was the only food they didn't lock up." He would share the food with Judy. Judy refused to talk during her time at the orphanage. She also refused to be parted from Arthur, so she was adopted out with him. She didn't speak for an entire year after she was adopted. Barbara Davidson's sister Mary was so undernourished by her foster mothers, she still fit in a high chair, One of the mothers was so angry that Mary tasted the butter she was churning that she made her sit in the high chair for 2 days straight and refused to feed her the entire time. Once this time in purgatory was over, the woman gave Mary a bucket containing mashed potatoes, chicken, biscuits, and gravy. She told her to feed it to the dog. Mary ate the food anyway and was beaten for doing so. During Joe Pennell's years in an orphanage in Memphis, many children, Joe included, were often put on 2-week-long fasts wherein they were given nothing but bread and water. To quote Joe, "We'd be brought into the cafeteria to watch the other children eat, but not be able to eat ourselves." This was done so that the workers could demonstrate the cruelty of which they were capable. Joe reflected on how it made him feel. It makes you know that you're a nothing. It makes you a nothing. And that stays with you all your life. Another way in which Georgia was cruel was in the way she separated siblings. Heidi Naylor experienced this. She was taken into Georgia's clutches at the age of 5, along with her 4 siblings. Though she experienced abuse at the orphanage like other children had, being separated from her siblings was far more painful, and those scars were long-lasting. In October of 1948, Heidi and her older sister Virginia were suddenly flown to California. To quote Heidi, "I remember it all, the plane in the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. She, Virginia, and 3 other children were taken to a hotel room by one of Georgia's staff, a woman named Alma Walton. None of the children knew they were going to be adopted when they entered the hotel room. To quote Heidi, and all of a sudden, with no preliminary, I was taken to an elevator and told I would never see my sister again. That was goodbye to your sister, Alma Walton said. Alma took Heidi to the lobby. It was filled with adoptive parents. Alma pointed out one couple, to quote Heidi, and she just nonchalantly said, "Oh, that will be your sister's parents." Then she pointed to another couple and said, "Oh, they'll be yours." Heidi mourned the loss of her siblings for many years. She began to search for them when she was 21. She commented on her prospects in doing so. The records were as tight as drums. She was quoted as saying to a journalist in an interview for the Memphis Commercial Appeal in 1980, "It was like hitting your head against a brick wall." The search took 30 years, but she was reunited with Virginia and her 3 other siblings, by then known as Arthur East, Judy Young, and Susan Trotter. Cleveland Pennell was 15 years old when he lost his 4-year-old sister Shirley Ann to Georgia's system. Their mother died on February 16, 1942. A newspaper headline commemorated the event and read as follows: "Mother dies, leaves 8 children." Cleveland recalled what happened a few days later. 2 days after she was buried, there was a knock on the door. It was a social worker. She worked for the Department of Public Welfare and under the table for Georgia Tann. "Are you taking care of your brothers and sisters?" she asked me. "Oh, you're such a good boy." She patted me on the head. Now it was 8 in the morning, and we were very poor. I had just made oatmeal for everybody. Of course, the beds weren't made, and the oatmeal pan was in the sink. And on that little pretense, she filled out a report. House unkempt, dishes in the sink. And the court took my sister away from my mother. Judge Kelly turned her over to Georgia Tann. Cleveland went to see Georgia. He begged her to return Shirley Ann. To quote Cleveland, she said, "Okay." She took me over there and I visited for half an hour. And then Georgia said we had to go. They had to pull my sister away from me. I mean, absolutely, she was screaming. The following week, Cleveland asked to see Shirley Ann. Georgia told him she had a bad cold and could not admit him. Cleveland commented on what followed. The following week it was, "Oh, she went shopping," and after that, blah, blah, blah. And the next thing you know, I never saw my sister again. Cleveland didn't give up. He searched for Shirley Ann for the next 37 years. He called the police. He called FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. He wrote letters to the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare. He would work obsessively, sometimes until 2 o'clock in the morning. He spent his annual 2-week vacations from work, driving from his home in Fall River, Massachusetts, to Memphis. Once there, he would go to Memphis City Hall and pore through old records. In 1975, he visited the Department of Vital Statistics in Nashville. There he spoke with a worker who, like the Memphis City Hall employees, told him she couldn't give him information about his sister because she'd been adopted. It was more than he could take. To quote Cleveland, "I broke down and started crying. It was a big public building and a crowd gathered. And I said, 'Don't you tell me I don't have a sister named Shirley Ann. I was there. She was born at home and I was there.' He apologized to the woman and went back home. That woman sent him a letter a few months later that said, 'Somewhere in the future, if I can help you, I will.' This gave Cleveland hope. He sent the woman a Christmas card every year for years. He recalled the doubts his family had about the operation. To quote Cleveland, a lot of the family said, 'Why don't you give up? She's probably dead by now. She's probably forgotten you.' I said, 'If she's alive, I want her to know she has a brother that's been looking for her for 37 years. In 1979, a Vital Statistics employee wrote him, saying, 'I could lose my job. I could lose everything by giving you this information. Your sister was adopted by a Hollywood couple in April of 1942. Cleveland and his wife immediately drove to California, as he put it, right to the door of the LA Times to put an ad in the paper. I had a little picture of my sister and put it next to the ad. It was 1 inch by 2 inch, and it ran on Mother's Day, May 13th, 1979. Georgia placed a lot of children in Los Angeles. By 1970, many of them were searching for their biological relatives. To quote Cleveland, I got a lot of calls from women crying, saying, 'That's me in that picture.' None of them were Shirley Ann. However, 2 people who had been placed by George at Tann and had become highly skilled in conducting searches for long-lost relatives contacted him. With their assistance, he was soon on the phone with a sister for whom he had been searching for almost 40 years. She had been looking for him too. She cried for 5 straight minutes when she realized who he was. Her memory of his name and the other siblings was not entirely clear, since she was only 4 years old when she was stolen by George Tann. She said she had been raised by a Hollywood actor and his wife, who were keen on showing her off, as she to some degree resembled child actress Shirley Temple. She told him they gave her everything but love. Georgia Tann and her staff were sadistic when it came to the children. They delighted in torturing them psychologically. When Barbara Davidson was 6 years old, she found a kitten and brought it to her bed. She recounted the consequence of this action. The women saw it, and they drowned it in a rain barrel, and they made me watch. And they said, "Absolutely no animals are allowed. Absolutely no animals." Then they put my hand in the water. Oh God, my hand in the water. It made me touch that tiny body. Barbara recalls the moment when she was separated from Mary. The last time we were together as children, we were in a big room with tile on the floor, and we must have known what was coming because we were clinging and crying. They wanted to take Mary away. 2 women came in and they couldn't get us apart, so they dragged Mary out of the room by the hair on her head. Mary had such beautiful, long blonde hair, and one of the women just wrapped it around her hand like a rope, and dragged Mary away. And she was screaming, and I was screaming, "Mary, come back! Don't leave me! Come back!" But she never came back. Barbara was sexually abused by a foster parent and her adoptive father. She also didn't like the impact it made on her personality. I was surprised my adoptive mother didn't send me back. When I left Memphis, I was hateful, mean. I did terrible things to my new brother. Hit him. Every time he turned around, he'd go up and down the alleys digging in trash cans for something pretty to bring me, and I'd throw it at him. I pushed him down when he was roller skating, and I broke his glasses. I don't know what eventually turned me around, but I realized my adoptive mother loved me. By the time I was 10, I started smoothing out, caring more about people and what I was supposed to do. The sisters reunited in 1986 when they were both in their mid-40s. Barbara remembers this occasion. The first time I saw Mary again was at the airport, and it was wonderful, wonderful. We went to my house and talked about our pasts, lay across the bed and looked at each other's photo albums. We told each other things no one else will ever know. We laughed and we cried. We looked at each other's clothes and asked, "What size shoe do you wear?" Stupid things sisters should have been doing all these years. And we did it in one night. But it was a wonderful, wonderful night. At 4 a.m., my husband woke up and said, "Aren't you two girls asleep yet?" Like we were a couple of 13-year-old kids. It was great. It was really, really great. It was the most wonderful night of my life. By 1938, Georgia Tann had made $1 million from her black market adoption business. That is approximately $15 million 2020 dollars. Her living victims might be happy to hear that the wealth she accumulated didn't bring her any happiness. Even if they struggled to take her down, the social workers, doctors, and other child welfare advocates who opposed her continued to cause her stress. She referred to them as, quote, "that bunch," as if alluding to a group of criminal miscreants. She could buy whatever she wanted, and often did. New cars, fur coats, multiple houses, a tourist court, 200 acres of timberland in a small motel in California, horses, a farm, livestock. She was remembered for being chronically angry. A Memphis taxi driver said in 1950, she became high-strung and blew off steam at the slightest excuse. She most frequently took out her anger on birth parents and reform-oriented social workers who were the bane of her existence. Adoptees and sometimes even her clients became targets of her wrath as well. She was most solicitous toward adoptive parents who were wealthy and socially connected. To all the others, she would pressure them to make large so-called donations. Social worker Mildred Stoves had a friend who adopted through Georgia. She recalled the effect Georgia had on people when she was angry. She terrified people. He was a teacher and didn't make much money, and Georgia would ask for $2,000, $3,000. His wife would tell me, "Miss Tann's threatening us. The threat is veiled," but Mildred said under these conditions, the adoptive parents, quote, "scraped up what they could." When one couple were unable to pay Georgia the $1,500 she demanded, she took back the child they were about to adopt. In 2020 figures, that meant demanding over $22,000. Another way Georgia Tann harmed adoptive parents and the children who were placed with them was by withholding their medical records. One pediatrician at Vanderbilt University Hospital in Nashville in 1949 spoke of, quote, "tragedies that could have been prevented if the adoptive parents had had full social and medical information before them at the time of the adoptions." One concerned a child who had been irreparably damaged in eyes, heart, and mind by a case of German measles, which his mother had during pregnancy. He spoke of a case that regarded the placement of 4 children who were born to the same mother. To quote the doctor, "as fast as the children were born, there was someone, Georgia Tann, taking the children out of her hands and handling adoptions of them. The mother had syphilis at the time the last child was born, and that child was adopted by a clergyman who knew nothing of the background." Once, after refusing to place a baby with a couple because of perceived religious incompatibility, Georgia had the child removed from the home and put in the Methodist hospital. There she died from dysentery that was contracted in the home. While her business thrived, Georgia's mental health was on the decline. In 1928, she became destabilized psychologically to such a degree that she was unable to deal with business matters. Her partner, Ann, noted that throughout 1933 and 1934, she was close to having a nervous breakdown. Georgia even told a Memphis journalist that in 1941 she was, quote, tired, worn out, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. This she remedied by buying her farm Tann wood. Anne was very important to Georgia's recovery during these periods. To quote June's daughter Vicky Finn, Georgia would disappear into her house with Anne for a few weeks and emerge as if everything was all right. Vicky said Georgia could be very impulsive. On the spur of the moment, she would just take off for Cuba. My mother and father, June's second husband, whom Georgia liked, wouldn't even know she was gone. Georgia would call and say, "Get down here right now. Drop everything. I want you to come down and keep me company. Let's go swimming. Let's party. Let's gamble." Her physical health had seen better days. She had severe arthritis and a limp caused by a car accident. She had had heart attacks in 1941 and 1943. She was diagnosed with cancer in 1945 by doctors at the Mayo Clinic. She refused to undergo surgery for this. She sought pain relief in narcotics. Another problem cropped up that no chemical could alleviate. Letters of complaint poured into Memphis from all over the country. Georgia and her lawyers received many angry letters from attorneys in Mississippi, Maryland, Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, Indiana, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and California. In many of these letters, the adoptive parents demanded information about the children Georgia wanted to place with them. Georgia's lawyer, Abe Waldauer, would deal with the complaints by threatening to cancel the adoptions. Fighting the Tennessee legislature was a larger battle. Still, by 1945, Georgia Tann's adoption practices were widely criticized by ethical social workers and other advocates in Tennessee. A bill was submitted to the legislature that would have required her to screen every candidate for adoptive parenthood. The purpose was to determine their fitness to not only ensure the child was provided for materially, but to ascertain the conditions of the adoptive parent's home, including the behavioral dynamic that might or might not act to the detriment of the child's safety and well-being. When Georgia caught wind of this, she blackmailed clients into sending telegrams to the elected officials that opposed the bill. She also used her legal and political connections. Unbeknownst to the bill's sponsor, Abe Waldauer assembled a quorum of legislators, all appointed by Edward Crump, in a secret meeting held before the state Senate's regular session. They agreed to defeat the bill and voted against it. As usual, Georgia won and the children lost. In 1947, Tennessee's adoption reformers drafted a bill that would authorize the state welfare department to investigate adoption proceedings. Georgia and Abe utilized their legal and political connections once again, and the bill was defeated. The only figure in the child welfare system in Tennessee at the time who could count on being protected was Georgia Tann. For the children, the suffering would continue. From a legal standpoint, Georgia Tann mattered more than all the orphan children combined. They had none of the rights and suffered all the tortures. The war wasn't over. In 1949, an adoption reform group was assembled that included Judge Samuel Bates, Memphis pediatricians who had submitted complaints about Georgia's practices, members of the clergy, and civic groups like the Junior League and the League of Women Voters. Some adoptive parents got on board after having been blackmailed by Georgia. One such parent was a Memphis florist named Jesse Jackson. He said the following to a journalist in 1950. "I found that I was being used by Miss Tann as a tool. I finally told her I was through being used in such fashion." He went on to describe how Georgia would address a telegram to state legislators, pressuring them to vote against adoption reform. It also demanded that it be sent over his signature. To quote Jackson, "She used many other adoptive parents in the same way until they rebelled, as I did." A huge blow was dealt to her political clout. Edward Crump lost his statewide power in 1948 when political outsiders Gordon Browning and Estes Kefauver were elected as governor and senator, respectively. Georgia bribed a legislator with pivotal voting power with a gift of 2 adopted children. She gathered support from as many adoptive parents as possible. Too little, too late. 24 years of suffering had occurred under Georgia Tann's adoption system, and many Memphians were fed up. The legislative sessions in Nashville were heated. A former Children's Bureau social worker who opposed Georgia's methods in 1925 but was still forced to adopt through her gave a speech that supported and urged adoption reform. Having concluded the speech, she walked into the Capitol lobby where she saw Georgia Tann and Georgia Robinson, who was superintendent of the Porter Home and Leith Orphanage. She walked up to Georgia Tann and said, "I hope you understand how I felt." Georgia said, "I certainly do understand how you felt." With hostility, she said, "I think you ought to know that I recently had a letter from the mother of your child." She considered this a threat to tell her adoptive son's mother where he was living. Like many adoptive mothers, she didn't want her son to meet his birth mother. She burst into tears. She likely felt better when the reform bill passed in both houses. Georgia and Abe were desperate and acted. This resulted in an amendment that excluded the bill's second paragraph, which was unrelated to Georgia's activities. The amendment directed the striking of the entire second paragraph of Section 5. Abe managed to secretly gain access to the bill's rough draft. He inserted a caret between second and paragraph. He added the words "and third," and then he added an S to the end of paragraph. Now the amendment excluded both the second and third paragraphs, which contained the reform measures that would have curbed Georgia's malfeasance. The bill was botched and tampered with, but the governor signed it into law. The children of poor couples were still not safe from Georgia Tann and would continue to endure the hardships to which she subjected them. Still, not only had Edward Crump's influence in the state capitol diminished, but he died in 1954. In 1950, 3 prominent adoptive fathers in Memphis submitted complaints to Governor Gordon Browning about being blackmailed by Georgia Tann. In autumn of that year, Browning closed down her home. This doesn't make him a hero. He delayed the announcement of Georgia's offenses until after her death. He dealt with her in response to complaints. He didn't act on the behalf of the adoptees and their birth parents. Only the adoptive parents were considered the priority. He undermined Robert Taylor's investigation to such a degree that it was more effective at raising awareness than at prosecuting Georgia Tann for her human rights violations. One stroke of luck for the victims was when cancer came to claim Georgia Tann in 1950. She was confined to her bed by August 12th. At this point, most of the money she spent was on medical supplies and staff. She received the best in medical care while she allowed infants and infected children to suffer and perish in her homes. She died in her home on September 15th. Fortunately, news articles were published 3 days before her death that exposed her shady dealings. Many Memphians speculated that she committed suicide to relieve herself of feelings of shame. Clearly, those people knew nothing about Georgia Tann. To quote her mother, using Georgia's nickname of Sissy, Sissy didn't do that. Adoptive parents were concerned that the staff who survived Georgia would endeavor to have their adoptive children returned to their birth parents. A law was passed by the Tennessee legislature that legalized those illegal adoptions. Georgia's relatives inherited nothing but shame from her. She didn't leave them any money either. All Georgia Tann left behind was an instructional legacy on how not to run an adoption system. The following quote is by Judge Wade S. Weatherford, ruling on an adoptee's petition to gain access to their adoption records. "The law must be consonant with life. Mankind is possessed of no greater urge than to try to understand the age-old question, who am I? Long after Georgia Tann's death, her lawyer continued to make an effort to block adoption reform. He also opposed an adoptee's rights to obtain information about their birth parents. To this day, gaining access to birth records remains a struggle in the United States. Another problem is that many birth parents do not want to be found. For the adoptee who is desperate to learn the truth of their biological lineage, the search for the truth can involve a lengthy struggle. This is an interview by Oprah Winfrey, who spoke with James and Thomas White, twins who suffered horrific abuse in Georgia Tann's adoption factory.
Well, in the 1930s and 40s, this woman, Georgia Tann, ruthlessly ran a black market baby ring, stealing over 5,000 children, selling them to the highest bidder. My next guest suffered horrible abuse from the moment that Georgia Tann's gang kidnapped them at age 5. They were swept into a dark world of torment. They were terrorized. Twin brothers, James and Thomas White, say that Georgia Tann is a wicked woman who ruined their lives. We're glad to have you join us. So you were literally, someone came into the house and stole you both, right?
Yes, they did. We were
5
years of age. We were taking a nap. And my oldest sister, which was at 13 at the time, she had left the house and went down the street to visit our grandmother. And while we were napping, these people came in and took us out of the bed. We were still in bed.
Wow. And do you remember what happened then? Where were you taken?
Well, was taken to Memphis, Tennessee, at the age of 5, and to the Tennessee Children's Home with Georgia Tann. We don't know exactly how long we were at the Tennessee Children's Family Home, but we spent a lot of time with Georgia Tann. She would take us places, me and my twin brother. So we have figured out that we had lived with Georgia Tann, quite a few times, for a long time. And then after that, she had, of course, now we don't have proof that she sold us, that she got money. But then she sold us to a couple out in California, out in Hollywood. And we don't know exactly how long we stayed there, out there in Hollywood.
Didn't you all run away when you were 7 or something?
Yes, we did. This was when we was in Hollywood with these very wealthy people.
Why would two boys want to run away from a wealthy home?
We were abused quite a bit. We were beaten. When I say beaten, I mean literally beaten. Back in those days, when the ladies did the ironing cord would screw off. And this is what this woman would beat us with.
Well, she had a problem with drinking. Him and her both, drank and partied quite a bit, and they would leave us alone at the house. So one night we just got tired of it, and we ran off from the home, from the house. And then a neighbor found us in a swimming pool. Of course, the swimming pool was not, full of water. Found us in a swimming pool, and we had marks.
You were hiding out in a swimming pool.
And she found all the marks on us, and so she called the police.
Then you got sent back to Georgia Tann?
Yes, and that's when the sexual abuse came in at the home. I can remember, me and my twin brother, we haven't talked about it up until about 3 months ago, and then we got it out. We started talking about the sexual abuse. I remember laying on the floor with blankets. I remember kids with no clothes on. I remember the screaming and the hollering, and I remember them telling us to shut up. Now, these was not young men or young ladies. They was adults. They was grown people that would touch
sexually
us.
Abusing the children?
Yes. They would touch us and hug us and kiss us, and they would put us in the
ways
bed.
that were not good?
That's right. They would put us in a big bed. I remember me and my twin brother in a big bed, and people just looking down at us while we was, and they had us to hug each other and to kiss each other, and well, it just goes on and on. That went on for, quite some time.
Okay, so then were you put in another home?
Yes, we was,
Sold again, you think?
well, see, we was in 2 homes in Memphis, Tennessee. Ronnie, you want to take this? You need to come in.
We are.
And did you switch names every time?
We've got so many names that
We don't know what to call each other half the time.
But we were in the Tennessee Children's Home Society at 1556 Poplar Avenue. And when Georgia Tann had too many children in that home, she would loan the kids out. There was no room for them to sleep.
No, so was this her home? This was her home?
This was the orphanage home.
Yeah.
She had a home, an estate outside in the country. But she put us in the Porter Leith Children's Home there in Memphis, where she placed a lot of the children until she could find someone to adopt them.
So what we know now is it really was a front for an orphanage home, and she was black marketing the babies.
Yes, ma'am.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
This is a segment from a 1992 episode of 60 Minutes on the crimes of Georgia Tann.
Black market babies could be a postscript to Leslie Stahl's story last week about Iron Curtain babies who were taken from their parents and handed over to families the East German government felt would raise them as loyal communists. Well, tonight's story is about babies right here in the United States, in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1940s, who were taken from their parents and not just handed over to other couples, but sold to other couples with the connivance of a corrupt judge. Steve Popper was one of those babies. He was born in 1943, but was taken from his mother the moment she gave birth. She searched for her son ever since, and now those years of waiting and wondering are finally about to be over. On board Flight 403, arriving at the Memphis airport, is her son, now 48 years old, a son she has never met.
There he is. Is that him? Oh, that handsome devil.
How you doing?
Okay, Rudy, bless your heart, Steve.
Good to see you.
Oh, this is what I've been praying for, Steve. Honey, it was for the little girl.
Don't be nervous, man.
Proud of you, Steve.
Mary Reed was unmarried back in 1943, and just moments after giving birth to her son, she was told to sign some routine papers.
Could you read them at the time? Were you capable of reading and understanding what?
I don't, because I think they probably just got me when I was under the influence of the, anesthesia, and everything.
She was groggy, but she signed, just like a woman named Georgia Tann told her to. Tann was well known as the director of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, and she promised she'd look after the baby until Mary was out of the hospital. But that is not what happened.
You went to the Tennessee Children's Home Society to try to get the baby
I
back?
sure did, They wouldn't give me no kind of information, no records, nothing.
What, they just turned you away?
They sure did,
It was only then that Mary learned those routine papers were actually adoption papers. She had been duped into giving up her son. And even though she went to court to try to get him back, it was no use. Years later, when a lawyer named Robert Taylor was appointed to investigate, he discovered Georgia Tann had forced a lot of young mothers to sign papers when they were too sedated to know what they were signing.
That's absolutely true. And I've had the mothers tell me that. Now, they would come, and if they were unsedated and tried to hold on to the babies after the baby was born, then Georgia Tann would step in and say, well, you don't want your people in your hometown to know about this, do you?
But Tann would never tell those mothers what she planned to do with their babies.
The parents thought they were going to be held in safekeeping, and before they could do anything, the babies had been sold and sent to New York or California.
And that is just what happened to Mary Reed's son. Less than a week old, he was sold to a family in New Jersey. They named him Steve Popper. He grew up knowing he was adopted from the Tennessee Children's Home Society, but never knowing the truth about how he was taken from his birth mother. He says he always believed he had been unwanted, abandoned.
I never had any desire to find my birth mother, birth father, because of the fact that I felt if they put me up for adoption, they didn't want me, so why should I want to find them?
But then this past summer, he read a magazine article about the scandal, and he investigated. And he discovered that his mother never meant to give him up, that she had fought to get him back.
It was like a bombshell, but here I was condemning this woman for giving me up all these years and never wanting to find her, and when in fact it was just the opposite. I was taken from her, and she was trying to get me back. She did want me.
That discovery led Steve Popper to search and search. And finally, he was able to learn his birth name, and then he found his mother.
I got her on the phone. She said, "Oh, honey, I've been waiting for this day all my life. Ever since you were born, I've been waiting for this day."
And he said, Mom said, when I get a chance, says I'm going to get down there and, see you the first chance I get. Oh, I never tell you, I was just crying and shaking all over. It was so excited.
At a house decorated with yellow ribbons, Steve Popper was welcomed home. He and his family exchanged photo albums and began to catch up on those lost years. And now there is another photo in the album.
Thank you.
For one family, a happy ending and a new beginning. But what about all the other families torn apart by Georgia Tann?
For during the 1940s, Tann took hundreds, maybe thousands of babies from their birth mothers, mostly women who were poor or uneducated and so couldn't fight back. And then she would place the babies with childless couples who would pay up to thousands of dollars. Tann told those parents the money was just to cover expenses. But in truth, most of the money went into Georgia Tann's pocket.
Tann printed slick brochures to advertise the children. At holiday time, she'd plant newspaper stories offering Christmas babies available for adoption. She shipped babies from coast to coast on late-night flights and then would distribute the babies to waiting parents in the lobby of a hotel like the Biltmore in Los Angeles. She provided children to Hollywood celebrities like June Allison, and Joan Crawford got her twin girls from Tann, too. Tann's baby business grew, and she needed more and more children. And so she turned to her good friend, a juvenile court judge named Camille Kelly, who was well connected in Memphis city government.
She had a stooge down in the welfare department when someone would apply for assistance because they'd lost their job. This person would get their name, get in touch with Camille Kelly. Camille Kelly would send a deputy out, pick them up, take them back, award custody to Georgia Tann, and Georgia Tann would sell them. They were gone before you could do much.
Tann seemed to care little about the qualifications of the adoptive parents. Many were abusive. And she also cared little about conditions in her own orphanage, for despite the publicity photos, medical care there was almost non-existent. During an epidemic of diarrhea, more than 40 babies died. But the adoptive parents knew nothing of the conditions at the home, nor for that matter just where their babies were coming from.
There was an inmate up at the Western State Hospital for the Insane that had babies just every year. No one knew who the father was or the fathers, whether they were other inmates or whether they were attendants. But she placed them out as being healthy children.
It was Taylor's investigation in 1950 that put Georgia Tann and the Tennessee Children's Home Society out of business. Georgia Tann died just as the results of the investigation were being made known. Judge Camille Kelly died a few years later. Neither had been prosecuted. Denny Glad is co-founder of an organization called Tennessee's The Right to Know. She helps adoptees track down their birth families, and she says nothing was ever done for the parents who were robbed of their children.
When they found that things were awful and that it was wrong, and Georgia Tann was proven to have indulged in fraudulent and destructive enterprise, they simply closed the books and hid it away.
Closed them up, sealed them up.
From shame, from cover-up, from...
As much as anything, to keep from having to admit that it ever happened.
These days, Denny Glad can be found combing through old documents in libraries and courthouses around Memphis. With the few records that have now been unsealed, she has helped hundreds of adoptees, like Steve Popper, whom you met earlier. Helped them to find the truth about where they came from. When we caught up with her, she was on her way to Memphis Juvenile Court with a woman named Pat Slaughtower, another victim of Georgia Tann. We joined Pat on a journey to find her roots, and at the court she saw for the first time the records that answered some of her questions.
It's your mother's handwriting. Oh my gosh.
Pat learned that she'd been one of 4 children growing up in a stable home, a loving home. But Judge Camille Kelly had deemed her parents to be unfit and simply took the children away, turning them over to Georgia Tann for adoption. Pat found some letters, wrenching letters, written by her mother, begging and pleading for her children.
One particular excerpt was my mother trying to see us children at Christmas time, and you just know she never got to see her children at Christmas.
Pat was nearly 4 when she was taken from her parents. Her brothers and sister were split up too.
Why didn't they keep a couple of sisters together, in my case, and a couple of brothers together. Those two brothers were 8.5 and 5.5. They were very aware that they were missing one another. Why did they so recklessly divvy our lives out?
To those questions, the dusty files contain no clue.
If Georgia Tann were sitting here opposite you, what would you want to ask her?
The one thing that keeps running through my mind is, how could you have done that? A woman aware of the sufferings of these people, how could you have done what you did?
And the same to Judge Camille Kelly?
Same, Judge Camille Kelly. How is it possible that you could have done that to children, to birth parents?
It was money that lured them into it, and I think they were probably the lowest people in the world morally to do something of this nature.
Fur coats, chauffeur-driven limousines, gambling trips to Cuba, summer cottage on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, social status with Hollywood's movie stars.
She owned a terrific amount of property, real estate. Camille Kelly was another one. She made $300 a month. She was a judge of the juvenile court. Yes. Made $300 a month, new Cadillac every year, a chauffeur, a housemaid, a cook.
And Kate Burke, president of the American Adoption Congress, says little is being done even today to protect parents and children from black market baby racketeers.
Is it possible any place in the United States today for a judge and somebody like a Georgia Tann to go into a home and take 2 or 3 or 4 kids and overnight send them Lord knows where, split up families, the way it happened with the Tennessee children?
Sure, it is. I mean, because of secrecy, and that's what makes all of this possible. Because once those records are sealed, that's it. You're out of here. You're safe.
So there can be a latter-day Georgia Tann.
Probably is. Probably is.
There's a postscript to the story of Pat Slaughauer. She was desperate to find her parents, but for years, her records were sealed too. So we contacted private investigator Catherine DeYounger. Working with a few clues that were available, she was able to track Pat's father to Los Angeles. Incredibly, he lived just a few miles away from Pat.
I was told by someone who was friendly with him in California in those later years that he had come out there to find his children. And that's what he did. He looked and looked for all the years that he was there. And here was one of his children just living just within the same Los Angeles area.
But that discovery came too late. Pat's father and mother had died. But she was able to find an older cousin who knew her parents well. And he remembered Pat, too. And on a farm in Louisiana, she met W.J. Smith and his wife Nettie May for the first time.
Tell me about my mom. Was she pretty?
She was pretty. Yes, sir. She was pretty. She was a beautiful woman. And your daddy, he wasn't no bad-looking gentleman. And they loved you a lot.
Pat has been reunited with a brother and her sister. And finding W.J. and his family has helped, too. But nothing can compensate her for the fact that she never had a chance to show her mother and dad what kind of person she grew up to be.
It was really important to me to let our parents know that I turned out okay. Because I felt like as much as I've hurt, I feel like they've hurt too. So, my gift to them would be I'm a very successful businesswoman, I feel. Something to be proud of. Instead of the stigma of what they've lived with.
That's your mother's right there.
For Pat Slaughauer, like a lot of children torn from their parents by the Tennessee Children's Home Society scandal, the answers have come too late.
Oh, I wish I could have met her.
Oh, you loved her.
I know.
Chances are there are thousands of men and women looking in right now who know that they were adopted through the Tennessee Children's Home Society, but who are learning for the first time what really happened there. And they must be wondering, was I willingly surrendered by my mother as a lot of babies were, or was I one who was stolen and sold? If you are curious, the organization known as Tennessee's The Right to Know is available to help. Contact Denny Glad, that's G-L-A-D. She's the only one in the Memphis phone book.
Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.